This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Okay, so we're going to connect learning, experience and life. And so, as I said before, you could say, I think question 1, how does learning work? Which leads to question 2, how does experience work? Which leads to question 3, how is life organised? But we're going to flip that in tonight, and we're going to start with how is life organised, then we're going to go to experience, and then we're going to get to learning. So we're going to sort of do it in the reverse order. Okay, so how is life organised? So the question in a sense is, what unit of analysis can help us understand how our lives are organised and structured? So what I'm going to point to and utilise here is the notion of occupations, vocations, callings from Dewey, which can also be understood as ways of being, which is from another author, philosopher called Heidegger. So ways of being, different ways of being. Our lives, we're living different ways of being. In here right now, you're living a certain type of occupation. And if you try to describe that, it might be a university student studying in a subject for breadth called so you could start describing this situation, and that's describing your occupation in this setting, and so it's describing who you are by the practices that you're engaging with and what you know in this setting. It's relevant to here. So so that's what we're going to sort of focus on first. Also, with the notion that, this is a John Dewey quote, that education through occupations, so thinking about, this is an occupation, combines within itself more of the factors conducive to learning than any other method. So he wrote that more than 100 years ago, and so people are still trying to understand in education, what that means. So, but basically what it means is that, for this subject at least, is that the occupation that you're living at a certain time is what you're concerned about, and you learn within it to do it better. So you'll be you're here studying, you're in this particular subject, but you're wanting to do well in the subject, you're wanting to get the grade in a sense and move on and learn what we've got to offer in this subject. But there's various occupations that are going to happen in this subject. You've already done one, which is all the running. So you can think that the running, you're being a certain type of person, you're doing certain types of things, and you need to know certain types of things to do it. So there's an occupation, a vocation, a calling. You're going to do the bushwalking, which is another type of occupation, another set of practices, and another set of knowledge that you need to know that brings all those three things together. Okay, so when we use the word occupation, sometimes we just think of it like a job. Okay, what's my occupation? Well, I'm a lecturer or something, or I'm a student, or I'm the job. Often it's the job you're going to be paid for. I'm a drink waiter, I'm a barman, I work at a supermarket, all those sort of things. But what Dewey sort of was trying to make the point of is that, and he used the example of an artist, is that you can't just be one thing. Our lives have many occupations in them. And so he said that if you were just trying to be one thing, if the artist was just one thing, that person would be a monstrosity. If someone was just one occupation, nothing else in their whole life, it'd be a bit weird. So that person must have all sorts of other occupations, and he opens it up in ways that we don't think of normally as occupations, like being a friend or a companion, supporting himself and others. So there could be, you could be involved in a job or something like that as well, but it could be in a political party, member of a family. So anything you're doing is occupationally oriented. We're never not in an occupation. So even, if you catch public transport here, being on the tram, being a tram commuter is a type of occupation. Being a cyclist, just commuting on a bike to, all these little things that we do are occupational, and how we describe and define them is really up to us in that moment. So what is meaningful for us in the moment, in this situation. Okay, so occupations aren't just jobs. So every person has a variety of occupations or callings. And one thing that happens for us, I think, is that as we grow, as we mature, we just have more and more of these things. Our repertoire of occupations grows and grows. And one thing we want to do is to increase it. We want to try out being different types of people. I could be this, I could be that. I wonder what it's like to be that. And if there's one thing about humans that is that we're continually creating new ways of being a human being, new ways of being a person. So a number of the occupations that are accessible today for you didn't even exist 10 years ago. I know my son, he works in social media, so with sport. So he's forging his own little company in this social media space, and that job didn't exist 10 years ago. And so he's having to create a lot of the practices and inform his clients about how things work or how much do you charge for this and that and the other. So all these things. So occupations are continually changing. And you can't isolate occupations from each other. Sometimes people compartmentalise their lives. So if you think, well, I know there's a mate of mine I've known for years, and he likes to compartmentalise his life. So friends in one group, he doesn't introduce them to anyone else. So I'm a friend of his in a certain thing, but he won't introduce me to friends in other parts of his life. And he keeps his life very compartmentalised. Don't ask me why, but doing that is, trying to separate occupations, separate parts of your life and isolate them is a challenging thing to do, and it's difficult to maintain. Okay, another thing, I could click on that URL there, but that just takes us to a Wikipedia page that talks about different occupations and occupational surnames. So the point I just wanted to make there is that many people's surnames are linked to occupations. A Cooper is someone who makes barrels. Does anyone know what a Fletcher is?
Yeah, someone who creates feathers of arrows.
Yeah, someone who makes parts of arrows. We all know what a baker is and a butcher. A tinker, who works with tin, and so many occupations in English, in the English language at least. So many surnames, occupational. And it's interesting that a lot of those occupations are, occupations that we don't do much anymore. Not many people these days would be a tinker.
What's the difference between having an occupation and just doing tasks? Say you have an occupation as, say, like a teacher, would you be like a mentor? Would you take on like a mentor application as one thing?
Yeah. So the question here is, well, the first part of the question is, I suppose it's, are you always in an occupation? Yeah, and yes, you're always in some occupation. And what occupation that is, it's really, you're the only one who can know that. Because it's, you start asking why am I doing this, why am I doing that? Well, it's to achieve these purposes for these practices and knowledge. So it's really only you really know. Okay. So some of your occupations, so think about occupations that you have. Well, when I was your age, I used to work at a bar, as a drink waiter, and behind the bar, I used to also work as a stocking shelves at a supermarket. I remember doing that. That was great fun. And so I used to deliver newspapers when I was a bit younger. So occupations for money, you'll have various occupations like that, but you'll also have many that you do that aren't sort of paid. Just being a friend to different people, that's something you're doing. Being here, of course, as a student is an unpaid occupation, but it's an important aspect of who you are, and how you define that. And you'll be involved in many other groups and many other activities, all of which are occupations. They're who you are at that time, and you know what practices you have to do to be that person, and there's certain knowledge you need to know in order to do that. And you're learning as well and changing in that occupation at the same time, which is what we're here to sort of focus on. Yeah, so being a uni student, there's all sorts of aspects to that, and I'm assuming everyone wants to get to this point and graduate at some stage. Family's really important in connection with this occupation of being a uni student. Friends, sitting in classes like this. So the practices of being a uni student in that sort of broad sense, when you first came here, if you can cast your mind back to when you first came to the university, there was probably a lot of things that you weren't sure about. So you're still being a university student, but there are many things that you had to learn and come to terms with. Things that now you probably don't even think about, and you just do, around the campus, and understand that it works like this, works like that. I don't know if you can remember going to your first class and maybe thinking, well, where should I sit? Who should I sit next to? What are the rules here? Am I with friends or am I by myself? All these sort of questions that now you're sort of pretty happy and working with. Being a runner has similar things. So these are pictures from a run that we did in the subject a number of years ago. People take on running in different ways. So while we use the label runner, when we think about it and how we're living it ourselves, it's a pretty broad label. So we've really got to get into the descriptions to really understand what we mean by that. Just like the word uni student, each of you would be living that in subtly different ways. It's not just one, but we do share it. And the same with being a bushwalker, if you've done that before, or when you go on the walks, there are many aspects to that. So you can break that down. So being a bushwalker, of course, you will be sharing a tent, so you'll also be a tent partner. You'll be sharing cooking, so you'll be a cooking collaborator with whatever meals you're going to work with. You'll be, maybe with Andy there'll be work to do with navigation, so you might take on some of that. There's all sorts of occupations within that occupation of bushwalker, but who you're being at the particular moment, only you know. So it's in that moment for you. Okay. So school-based occupations. So this might just help with that sort of notion a bit more. So at school, you normally think, I'm a student, a school student, secondary school student, but every subject you go to, so like this subject you've come to tonight is probably quite different than many of your other subjects. So who you are in this subject is a little bit different. If you're, these kids are in year 10, so if you're being an English student and you're walking to English class with a particular teacher, you sort of know who you're meant to be in that class. If you've done the class for a little while, you know where you've got to sit, you know what you've got to do in that class, what you should know to be able to get on and be that person in that class, which could be quite different from being a maths student. And in the pictures we've got here, so being an English student, people are sitting around circular tables and there's talking. In the maths class at this school, this girl's out in the middle here because she was talking. So the teacher asked her to bring her table out to the middle to stop her talking. And normally everyone sits in a horseshoe shape around the room to stop people talking. So different practices, different expectations, being a maths student, being a science student at this school, everyone's in rows, looking at the teacher, look at this class, everyone's just in rows, and the expectation is that you don't talk, but that happens. And being a history student, again, more like English, one of humanities, we want more discussion, more talking. So in school as well, different occupations, different ways of being a person, different practices. And on an outdoor ed camp, like I was saying before, these kids, again, it's the same year 10 camp, and they were doing different activities, but those activities also are asking you to be a different type of person. So in the canoeing or the kayaking, you're in a two-person boat, and sort of you have to work with people, so it's a different way of being a person, different practices, different knowledge, different to walking along the beach for half a day together, different ways of interacting and what you can do, cooking together, sleeping together, it's quite a different ways of being. Okay, so how is life organised? So the argument I'm making here is that life is organised by occupations. So there are many occupations that we have in our lives. So then you think, well, how do we grow with these occupations? So one model could be through stages. So as we grow through occupations, we sort of live them, and then they sort of drop off into the past and we forget about them and they're irrelevant. So that rocket sort of notion. Another model might be, building a brick wall. So the occupations you've lived, and you were living occupations even when you were born, and potentially before you were born, you were doing things, and being someone, practices and knowing things that, were very, foundational to, who you are now. So the stage idea, I'm not a big fan of it, because what it's suggesting is that, and I'm using Piaget's, if you're familiar with Piaget and psychology and his notion of stages, developmental stages, you're sort of working through stages with the aim of becoming an adult and maturing. But in that sort of model, the adult stage is, the best, and that's where we're heading to. And every previous stage is deficient in relation to the adult stage. It's also suggesting that you move on from those stages, and those stages aren't, a part of who you are anymore. Whereas I prefer to think of, occupations and your life as building like a brick wall. Again, it's a basic analogy, but as we grow, we open up new doors, and occupation opens doors to further occupations. And so we take, this occupation of you being at uni has opened up doors to further occupations that you could be, ways of being a person that you've taken on. And they can open up more. And so our lives sort of work through these occupations that we take on and blossom in that way. So, and also the ones that we've lived are still there in us. It's not like they've disappeared. One time when I was a lot younger, when I was at primary school, I remember collecting football cards. And some people may remember collecting footy cards at primary school. And for me, they used to come with chewing gum, Scanlon's chewing gum. And one time I smelt that chewing gum. Someone gave me a piece of chewing, I smelt it. It smelled exactly like the chewing gum out of the footy cards. And it just took me back to the footy cards, how important they were, collecting them, swapping them, all the sort of things that we used to do. And things that were important back when I was in grade 3. So those things are still with us, and you can probably smell is a big thing to sort of throw you back into different parts of your life, but you can probably take yourself back to what it was like to be in an occupation that you lived when you were a lot younger, and you can still feel that occupation, what was important, what you needed to do, what you needed to know, all those sort of things. So they're still with us. And still in some way important in our lives. Okay, so that's how is life organised. So that was our first question here. So if we can move on now, so we're thinking life is organised by occupations, we're always in an occupation. So that's the main point there. So now number 2, how does experience work? Okay, because these occupations are always part of our experience. So let's do that one. So an occupation, as we've sort of been alluding, is a way of doing things, set of practices. So here you knew when you came in the door, you knew that you should sit down and maybe find your friends. I've been trying to get people to sign that thing. And, so that's sort of probably a norm in this class and maybe not in others. But yeah, you sort of knew what you had to do. Now if you'd come into the room and come up and turned on the computer, and started doing things up here, people would have gone, is that guy taking the class today, or what? What's going on? So people might have thought, well, who is he? He's not one of us. He's not a student. Maybe, or is he? So questions about practices. So an occupation is also a way of knowing. So when you come into this room, what you know, what is important to know, is circumscribed by the occupation that you're living. So, the things that you know in this context, you know a lot more than is relevant in this situation right now, of course, because you've got so many more occupations in your life where different sets of knowledge is relevant and meaningful, connected with different ways of doing things. Like, we've already done the running, so we know that, running has a set of practices and knowledge that's pretty irrelevant in here. So you know that stuff, but it's for somewhere else. And so there are many other parts of your life where, knowing is encircled and circumscribed by the occupation. So what Dewey says, I think he puts it quite well. So it's an organising principle for information and ideas, for knowledge and intellectual growth. And it provides an axis which runs through an immense diversity of detail. And what he means by that is that, there's, in this situation, you could be all sorts of different people. For me coming in here, I know this in different ways. So there's all, if you added all the details that I see to it, a cleaner potential will come in here later to do that. So they'll see this situation very differently, this room. You could think that this room is a bit like a movie theatre. We could probably put up a movie and watch it and it wouldn't be too... So in every situation, there's so much detail, but your occupation helps you make sense of that and provides that axis that cuts through so you have an understanding of what's going on. If you go to a situation that you're not sure of and you're thinking, well, what's going on here? You try to connect it with some occupation that you're familiar with, and to see if that helps you make sense of it. So, occupations are helping us in that regard. And also, as I've been alluding, an occupation is a way of being. So, who are you? And it's trying to talk there with the holistic notion of the occupation. So, being a student in this setting is holistic in the sense that you're just living it in the moment, and you're not necessarily sort of questioning it to any major degree, but it's characterising the whole situation. So if you could imagine you walked into the door and thought you were going to the movies and came in and sat down, and some guy like me comes up and turns on PowerPoint, you go, what's going on? Because who you are in the situation doesn't gel with what you expected to sort of happen. The holistic sense of the situation now is problematized, and you're trying to think about different parts of it in order to make sense of it. And that's what we're going to talk about a bit with learning. But wholes, for purposes of education, are connected with a concern or interest. And so an interest, you could say being a runner, there's an interest in running that is helping to qualify that whole. So the relationship between those three things, so we've got three things. Occupation is a way of doing, occupation is a way of knowing, and occupation is a way of being. My argument to you, and there's some writing that, if you want, we'll go into it a little bit tonight, but they're related because who you are, so being a student in this setting, suggests the practices, how you do things, which need the knowledge, in which the knowledge that you need to know is embedded. So knowing is embedded in doing. So knowing things, you know things so that you can do things, and you're doing things because of who you are in the setting. So that's the way I'm sort of trying to connect the three. If you're a runner, you know the things you need to know for running because you need to do running, and you're doing the practices of running because you're a runner. So those three things, you cannot disconnect them, because if you change something that you know, it will subtly change the practices in some way and change who you are. So who you are as a runner is a bit different now. So things you may have learnt on the training sessions with some of the coaches we had, you know something a bit different. The practices now, how if you take on that knowledge, it will affect your practices in some way. And then so who you are as a runner is a bit different. So I'm arguing that that's learning. So learning is impacting not just knowledge, but it's impacting practices and impacting who you are. And you could use an example, a more traditional example, say, doing an examination. If we're doing some sort of assessment at uni, knowing something, learning something, knowing something different shifts the practice. So say it's mathematics. So you're learning something to do with mathematics. So you're doing something in class. You learn a new fact about some aspect of mathematics. That will impact how you practice mathematics when you're doing things to do with mathematics, like some form of equations or problems or solving those things. But that also means that who you are as a mathematician or a mathematics student or whoever you are in that setting is a little bit different now than it was before. So like we were saying about being a uni student, who you are as a uni student now is quite different than when you first started at uni. So you've learnt lots of bits and pieces, and so the practices that you undertake now, things that you do and who you are is different than it was at the start, and you're doing a lot of those things without even thinking about them now because you just know them. You don't have to worry about them. But if you come across an issue or a concern or a problem, you then have to think about it, try to work it out, and it can shift and change who you are as a uni student if it's in that frame. And so, but then the next time you encounter it, it may not be something you even need to worry about because your practices and who you are have shifted a little bit to accommodate the change.
Can it also work the other way? Can you just decide with the existing knowledge you have that you want to work for like being a certain type of
Sure.
Or is that just how it normally operates?
No, I mean if you decide that you want to be in a certain way, then you have a sense that it has to change how you do things, and how you know things is going to have to change as well. So anytime you change any of these, it changes all three, is just what I'm saying. Yep. So if you think about bushwalking, using our examples, things that you come to know will change who you are as a bushwalker. So who you are as a bushwalker before the briefing will probably be a little bit different after the briefing. When you head off, you'll be different when you come back. Subtle differences about you and a bushwalker. Same with being a runner. You've already changed, in the sense of being a runner, just through the experiences we've had. And as I said before, example of being a university student, things are shifting and changing. Okay, so those three things shift and change. It's also just a quick example, of if you like, the power of sort of thinking in this way. If you see someone doing something, you'll often make assumptions about what's going on. So if you see someone speeding, say in a car or on a motorbike or something, speeding down the street, you think, you could make an assumption that the person's a hoon and they shouldn't be speeding and they're so when we see someone doing something like that, we're making assumptions, we're making judgments about who they are and who and how. What means we think we know what they know, the knowing that they've got in that situation. But that person speeding down the street could have been on, trying to get a sick family member to hospital. So if we saw that and thought, oh, that's someone trying to get a sick family member to hospital, what they know now is very different than the hoon driving down the street. So who they are is really important for knowing, for being aware of them, how we make judgments on what we're seeing in certain situations and assumptions about what people know. So we're so, education, we're so focused on knowing, that we're focused on the activities and the things we want to do with that knowledge, but we often don't take into consideration who we are and because who we are gives those practices and that knowledge meaning. Okay, so another way of thinking, so I've said this, practices and skills knowledge, but identity is another way of thinking about it. But identity doesn't tend to get into the detail that we're sort of thinking about here in terms of practices and knowledge. So, but identity is another word that we often use to talk about who we are. Okay, so it's a way of being, way of doing, way of knowing all at once. So we're back, we're going to do the last question now. So we've done how is life organised, so we've thought about occupations. How does experience work? So we've been thinking about, occupations as ways of being, ways of doing, ways of knowing. And now we're going to think about how does learning work, which I've sort of alluded to already, but how does learning work in this frame? Okay, so we saw this before, education through occupations. Now I'm going to introduce two types of experience. So we've said that experience is being, doing, knowing. Now, being, doing, knowing are connected in both of these types of experience. So these are different types of experience that the framing of occupations feeds into and is part of. So we're not separating being, doing, knowing here, we're just thinking about two ways of thinking in a broad sense. So reflective thinking, that's pretty basic. It's analytical thinking. How, when we're trying to understand something, we normally pull it apart and look for relationships, which is what science is, which is how we normally think about problem solving, which is what education is mainly focused on, trying to get us to do that type of thinking, which you guys, I'm sure, are very, very good at, or you wouldn't be here. But aesthetic experience is something that we don't often connect in. And so what aesthetic experience is trying to get at is that reflective experience is always, qualified emotionally somehow. It's coming from a situation, a moment, and pulling apart that moment that was already together. So when there's not a major problem to resolve and we're just getting on with things, you could say, well, that's aesthetic experience. And aesthetic here doesn't mean beauty. It's more calling on the root word, the ancient Greek root word, which is about perception. So we're thinking about how we're aware of this moment, the aesthetic of it, in a sense, the feel of it. So you can, if you can work with me experientially, you can sense this moment we're in now. Don't analyse it. You're just aware of it. And here we are now. So of being aware of it, but we're not analysing it. So this is us. But if there's a problem with this, so I had a problem before I couldn't get the computer sort of to work. So when you're walking there, I think, it's pretty cruisy. I'll just sort of set up and suddenly I've got a computer issue, and now I have to reflect. Now I'm thinking, well, what's going on here? What are the parts of this situation that aren't working? How do I resolve it? And what I had done, I shouldn't say this, what I had done though, and I called up support, and I was on the phone to them, some of you may have seen, but what I'd done is connect my laptop to the connector from the desktop instead of using the laptop connector. And so I kept thinking, how does the bloody laptop thing doesn't work? And then the person, came in online and zoomed in and helped me fix it up. So, but yeah, my aesthetic experience of that moment was qualified by, me in the situation, being that certain type of person, not any major issues to resolve, so I'm sort of just getting on with things. I know how these things work. I get set up, put my laptop up, turn it on, put my stuff down, all that sort of thing. But then if there's a problem, I need to reflect. And so reflecting is pulling it apart. And so aesthetic, as I said, feeling, emotion, characterised situation, Dewey said something interesting that, experience is emotional, but there are no separate things called emotions in it. And what he was trying to get at there was this aesthetic experience where you can talk about different emotions, but as soon as you're talking about different emotions, you're reflecting on it. So you're pulling it apart and saying, oh yeah, this situation is characterised by these emotions. So I'm feeling bored, or I'm feeling this, or I'm feeling that. So I'm starting to pull it apart and to try to analyse it and sort of understand it in that way. But in its whole sense, it's emotional in some way, but we're not, describing particular emotions. So aesthetic experience. So all elements of our being that are displayed in special emphases and partial realisations, what that means is, we're reflecting and pulling things apart, so it's partial, are merged in aesthetic experience. So where things are just whole, they're just all there. And they're so completely merged in the immediate wholeness of the experience that each is submerged. So we're not aware of it. We're just, this is just it. It's all connected. So I'll keep moving on there. I've talked about problems. Dewey then talked about this sort of method of problem solving, what he thought problem solving was. Let me just unpack this for you. So the brown bits at the top and bottom, pre-reflective, post-reflective, they're just trying to say, well, we're normal. If there's no problems, we're just in aesthetic experience. We're sort of getting on with things and not have to reflect too much about stuff, like you might do if you're sort of you're going to brush your teeth and just getting toothpaste or whatever. Things are all easy to do. But if there's an issue, the first thing that will happen is that the emotional tone of the situation will shift. So there's some perplexity, some confusion, some doubt, something's not right. And that could then lead you to reflect if you take heed of it. You might not, it's up to you. You might just avoid it, think, this isn't working, I'll do it later. I'll get onto something I'll go and watch TV or something. I'll avoid it. But if you do take it on, well then you're trying to resolve it. And there are two methods that he talks about as trying to resolve some sort of problem. One method is more focused on just keeping on doing stuff. So if you've got a problem, you're just going to try stuff. You're not going to think too much about it. You think a bit. Oh, it could be this, I'll try that. It could be this, I'll try that. Like I was doing with the computer, it could be this, could be that. But if you want to really get at it, then you want to go to the red bits and that's what I had to do eventually. And I eventually had to ring, which was one of my solutions, ring the support person. But I had to really sort of take a careful survey of the situation and elaborate what was, and consequent elaboration of the tentative hypothesis, what do I think is going on, to make it more precise and consistent. So what that number 4 is getting at is that I'm also potentially connecting to knowledge in other occupations. So it's not that knowledge is always confined and never accessible from one occupation to another, but when I need to, I can think, well, maybe it's got something to do with this. And I can think, well, yeah, and so the learning that you do in disciplinary work, it's often sold as, well, this could help you here, and this could help you here, which isn't necessarily in the discipline, but is in some aligned situation. So you're calling on, and there's a fellow by the name of Thomas Kuhn who looked at KUHN, who looked at the history of science and saw that significant change in science often occurred when people came into a science from another science, so crossed from one into the other, or they were relatively new into that science, and so they weren't held by all the traditions and norms of practice of the science. They could bring a different way of looking into the situation and see the problem differently, and thereby offer a different way forward in terms of solution. So calling on other occupations is a really important part of how we solve things, but So the way that flows sort of in learning, and now I'm going to try to map it to being, doing and knowing. Remember this, that sort of shape, the shape that I had up before? So I'm saying being, when it's just being, where it's aesthetic experience and we're just living who we are, doing and knowing are embedded in there, and we're just getting on with things. If we have a problem, then who we are at the time, not necessarily that we're going to sort of say, well, who I am is a problem, but the aesthetic, the holistic sense of the situation is sort of disturbed, and now if we decide to, we can start thinking about it. We can just make a tentative interpretation, you know, what's going on, I think it's this, and then have a crack at doing something to fix it. So trial and error is what Dewey called it, and we all do that at certain times. But if that's not working or you decide to go further, then you want to really do some problem solving, which is of course what university is all about, and wants to try to teach you how to do sort of much more developed problem solving. Okay, so being, doing, knowing, trial and error, regulated reflection, don't worry too much about that. Another way to present this, I'm using the greying. I've made that diagram grey to suggest that it's in the background, it's submerged, like you were saying, things aren't standing out. So an aesthetic experience, being, doing, knowing, are submerged. We're not worrying, thinking about them, they're just there. Reflective experience can focus on knowing. So what do we know here? What's the issue? It can focus on doing, can focus on being, can, like you were saying before, can think about, well, who do I want to be? So that could be the primary question. And so we get to this technical definition, and I'm winding up here, technical definition of education being that reconstruction or reorganisation of aesthetic experience, in a sense. So we're going to reconstruct and reorganise what was our aesthetic experience, which adds to the meaning of that experience. So it's now more meaningful. It means something different. Who we are shifted, the way we do things is shifted, and what we know is shifted, and which increases the ability to direct the course of subsequent experience. So aesthetic and reflective experience are working together there to achieve that. Reconstruction, reorganisation is the work of reflective experience, playing with being, doing, knowing in an occupation, and we're reconnecting everything. We're going back the other way now, and so those three questions we've sort of unpacked and looked at for you.